Are you applying for Azure Cloud jobs like Cloud Architect, Administrator, Developer, Security Specialist, etc., but feeling stuck or unsure how to prepare? Then you are not alone. The truth is, Azure interviews are tough because employers expect more than just theory. They want proof that you have worked with real world Azure tools and challenges. And with the cloud constantly evolving, it's easy to feel overwhelmed and unsure which questions actually matter. And that's why in this video, we are sharing the most commonly asked real Azure interview questions tailored specifically for these key roles. Right now, we have categorized the questions separately for Azure Administrator and Azure Solutions Architect roles with easy explanations to help you focus on what matters most. And if you want to take it a step further, we have a free masterclass on Azure Cloud that's helped thousands of learners transform their careers and earn up to $250,000 in less than 6 months. Here you will get certification tips, hands-on projects, and a proven 3-step framework that's helped over 45,000 learners like Jobby, SJ, Showit, and many more get certified and land jobs. So register now. The link is in the description below. So now without further delay, let's start with the Azure interview questions.
Okay, so let's start with a few common interview questions that nearly every interviewer asks, and then we'll move on to role-based questions. So our first question is, tell us about yourself. Alright, this is one of the most common interview questions you'll face, but here's the thing. It's also one where many candidates stumble or miss a big opportunity to stand out. So while interviewers ask, tell me about yourself, what they really want to know is, how can you help solve their problem? They're not interested in a full history of your life, your schooling, or every certification you have, even though most people go straight into rambling about all that. So instead, think of this question as your chance to show why you are the perfect fit for the role. How do your skills and experience align exactly with what they need? So here's a simple approach. So you can start with a brief introduction that directly connects your experience to the job you're applying for. For example, you could say that I've spent the last few years working extensively with Azure Cloud Solutions, focusing on this and this, which I know is more important for this position. I'm excited about the opportunity to bring that expertise to this company and help tackle your cloud challenges. So as you can see, you should keep it short and tailored. And also here's a powerful little twist. Flip the question back to the interviewer. So you can say something like, I could go on about my background, but I want to make sure I'm focusing on what matters most to you. So could you share what specific challenges or goals you are looking to address with this role? And that way, I can highlight how my experience fits exactly what you need. So why does this particular question from your side work so well? Because now you are showing that you are not just here to talk about yourself, but that you truly want to understand their needs and position yourself as a solution. So it also invites a conversation rather than a one-sided monologue, which helps build rapport. Now our next question is technical or project related questions. So now that you're preparing for an Azure interview, one of the toughest parts is of course anticipating the technical questions you might face, especially those specific to projects or skills listed in the job description. So here's a smart tip for you. Use ChatGPT to help identify those interview questions. Yes, AI can be a powerful study partner. So here's how you can do it. First, you can start with the job description. So you can copy the key responsibilities and skills mentioned in the job posting. For example, if the job requires expertise in Azure DevOps, ARM templates, or Kubernetes, those should be your focus areas. After that, you can ask ChatGPT to generate questions, like you can give prompt such as give me common interview questions for an Azure Cloud Engineer role that involves ARM templates, Kubernetes, and DevOps pipeline. So then ChatGPT will generate a list of potential questions, often including scenario-based, technical, and problem-solving questions. So you can then pick the ones that align closely with the job description. Of course, you have to review once. Now, why is this approach very effective? Because it helps you focus your preparation on what matters most for the specific role you want. So instead of just guessing or relying on generic questions, you are tailoring your practice to the exact skills and challenges the company cares about. Now, this is also one of the most common questions interviewers ask, which is any question that you would like to ask us. So when the interviewer finally asks this question, it's your moment to shine and leave a lasting impression. So here's a powerful question that most candidates hesitate to ask, but it can seriously set you apart. So based on everything we have discussed today about my background and experience, is there any reason why you wouldn't offer me this job? So I know it might feel a bit uncomfortable or even bold to ask that, but hear me out, this question is pure gold for a few reasons. First, it gives you a direct opportunity to address any doubts or objections the interviewer might have right then and there. Maybe they're worried about a specific skill gap or experience you don't fully match. So by bringing it up yourself, you show confidence and a willingness to face concerns heads on. Next, think about it like a salesperson handling objections. Great salespeople don't avoid tough questions. They lean in, listen carefully, and respond thoughtfully to clear up misunderstandings. So you're essentially selling yourself here, and handling objections well is key. Second, this question saves you time and heartache down the road. So instead of walking away feeling great about an interview only to get a rejection later, often without clear reasons, you get honest feedback immediately right on the spot. So you'll know exactly what's holding them back and can decide if this role is really right for you. So yes, it's a little uncomfortable, but it's one of the smartest moves you can make to stand out, show confidence, and get clarity. Now, after your interview, always send a thank you mail. The interview is giving you something very valuable, their time, and it's important to show appreciation for that. So a simple follow-up not only shows professionalism, but also keeps you fresh in their mind. It's a small step that can make a big difference in how you are remembered. So never skip this, it's key to leaving a positive, lasting impression. So now that you're prepared to tackle some common questions from interviewers, let's dive into role-specific questions and how to answer them effectively. So our first role is Azure Administrator. So let's start with the first question. So imagine the interviewer asks, suppose you notice a sudden spike in CPU usage across multiple Azure VMs. How would you investigate and mitigate this issue? So your approach should be, step 1, show your investigative approach. Start by explaining that you'd use Azure Monitor to check performance metrics. This helps pinpoint which VMs are affected and when the spike happened. Mention using log analytics to dig deeper, querying logs to find unusual processes or schedule tasks that could be causing high CPU. Step 2, look for recent changes. Explain that you would check for recent deployments, backups, or maintenance jobs that might correlate with a spike. This shows you understand the environment and possible causes. And then you can talk about mitigation strategies. So talk about how you would temporarily scale up the VM sizes or add instances to balance the load. Also mention optimizing or stopping resource-heavy apps, setting up alerts for early warnings, and using auto scale to handle future spikes automatically. So while answering this question in this way, you are demonstrating a clear, logical troubleshooting process that uses Azure tools effectively, along with practical ways to resolve the problem and prevent it from recurring. Now our next question is, a critical Azure VM has gone down unexpectedly. Walk me through your approach to restoring service with minimal downtime. So here's how you can answer this question. First, investigate immediately. Start by saying you would check Azure activity logs and Azure Monitor to understand what caused this failure. Maybe it can be a recent change, a system fault, or an update gone wrong. Next step, try a quick fix. So mention that you would attempt to restart the VM through the Azure portal or Azure CLI to see if it recovers quickly. This shows you aim for the fastest possible resolution. Step 3, failover plan. So if a restart doesn't work, explain that you would use Azure Site Recovery to failover to a replicated VM in a secondary region. So this minimizes downtime by bringing the system back up elsewhere. Step 4, communication. Highlight the importance of notifying stakeholders about the outage and keeping them updated on progress. This shows professionalism and transparency. Step 5, post-incident actions. So after service is restored, talk about reviewing backup policies with Azure Backup to ensure data integrity and to adjust anything necessary to prevent a repeat failure. And finally, talk about learning and documentation. Mention documenting the incident and lessons learned so your team can improve the disaster response next time. So in this answer, you are showing a structured, thorough approach from quick troubleshooting to disaster recovery and communication, which is exactly what interviews want to hear. So now let's move on to our third question, which is how do you implement and manage role-based access control, RBAC, in a large Azure environment to enforce the least privilege? So here's a clear way to structure your response. First, you have to define roles based on business needs. Start by explaining that you align RBAC roles with actual business functions and responsibilities. This means creating roles that reflect what users need to do. No more, no less. Step 2, assign roles at the most specific level. Highlight that you assign roles at the most granular scope possible, whether at the subscription level, resource group, or down to individual resources. This limits excessive permissions. Step 3. Regular auditing and reviews. Mention that you regularly audit role assignments using Azure AD Access Reviews. This helps identify and remove unnecessary permissions, keeping security tight. Step 4. Use advanced controls for critical access. Explain that for sensitive or critical resources, you implement just-in-time (JIT) access and use privileged identity management. So these tools limit how long elevated privileges are active, reducing security risks. And step 5 comes automation and policy enforcement. So finally, say that you use Azure policies and automation to enforce RBAC consistently across the environment, minimizing human error and ensuring governance. So here your answer shows you understand security best practices deeply and how to balance operational needs with minimizing access risks. Exactly what interviewers want to hear from you. So right now we have covered 3 questions. Let's move on to our 4th question, which is describe a situation where you had to optimize cloud costs while maintaining performance and scalability. What steps did you take? So now here's a great way to structure your answer. First is identify the problem clearly. Of course, start by explaining how you noticed rising cloud costs due to over-provisioned VMs and underutilized resources. This shows you're aware of cost inefficiencies. Next, mention that you leveraged Azure Cost Management and billing to dig into spending patterns. So this demonstrates your ability to use native tools for cost visibility. After that, talk about right sizing VMs based on actual CPU and memory usage. Also mention scheduling auto shutdown for development and test environments using Azure automation, a smart way to avoid unnecessary charges. The next step that you would explain is that you use reserved instances for workloads with steady demand, which significantly cuts compute costs. After that, highlight how you applied tagging policies to categorize costs by project and department, improving transparency and accountability. And finally, stress that throughout these changes, you monitored performance metrics closely to ensure your cost-saving measures didn't impact availability or scalability. So this answer shows you balance cost optimization with business needs, use Azure tools effectively, and think strategically, key skills that interviewers expect from a candidate. And now before moving on, if you want this guide in a downloadable format, you can pause this video and scan this QR code given over here so that you can download this document. So now let's move on to our next question, which is you are tasked with automating resource provisioning and configuration for multiple environments. What tools and approaches would you use? So this answer could be framed in this way. Step 1, use infrastructure as code with ARM template. So you can start by saying that you use ARM or Azure Resource Manager templates to define your infrastructure as code. So this allows you to deploy resources consistently and repeatedly across development, testing, and production environments. Step 2, mention that you store these templates in a version control system like Azure Repos, which helps track changes and maintain code quality. Then you integrate these deployments into Azure DevOps pipelines for seamless automation. After that, explain that after provisioning, you use Azure Automation runbooks combined with PowerShell scripts to configure VMs, such as installing necessary software or applying policies. And step 4 is usage of additional tools for complex or multi-cloud scenarios. So if needed, say you leverage Azure CLI scripts or Terraform, especially when working across multiple clouds or requiring more advanced provisioning. So by saying this answer, it shows that you understand key automation tools, how to apply infrastructure as code principles, and how to maintain consistency and reliability in multi-environment deployments. Exactly what interviewers are looking for a candidate in this position. Now let's move on to our 6th question, which is explain how would you design a backup and disaster recovery plan for critical workloads in Azure? How would you test its effectiveness? So here's a solid way to answer. You can start by explaining that you begin by working with stakeholders to identify which workloads are critical. Then you define recovery time objectives, how quickly systems must be restored, and recovery point objectives, how much data loss is acceptable. After that, you can mention that you use Azure Backup to take regular snapshots of VMs, databases, and files with retention policies that meet business needs. Step 3 is to explain that you replicate workloads to a secondary Azure region using ASR. So this enables failover if the primary region goes down. And then you have to highlight that you conduct regular failover drills to stimulate outages and measure whether RTO and RPO targets are met. Testing helps ensure the plan works when it matters. And then you can say that after tests, you review results, update documentation, and run books, and then staff so everyone is prepared. So by answering this way, you demonstrate a comprehensive approach to business continuity, from planning to testing and continuous improvement. Now, our seventh question is, an application is experiencing intermittent network latency issues. How would you use Azure networking tools to diagnose and resolve the problem? So when asked this question, you can start by explaining that you'd use Azure Network Watcher to monitor traffic flow and analyze connection diagnostics between the resources affected by latency. This helps identify where delays or packet losses might be occurring. After that, you can mention that you would review NSG rules to ensure none are unintentionally blocking or throttling traffic intermittently. And then explain that you would verify route tables to spot misconfigurations or conflicting routes. If the setup involves hybrid environments, you would also check VPN or express route connections. After that, talk about using traffic analytics to detect unusual traffic spikes or patterns that might explain latency. And our last step is to apply fixes based on findings. So based on your analysis, you might adjust NSG rules, optimize routing, or recommend scaling networks. Components like Azure Firewall or load balancers to improve stability and reduce latency. So this answer shows you know the right Azure tools and a systematic troubleshooting approach. Exactly what interviewers want when it comes to networking problems. Now let's move on to our eighth question, which is, how do you handle patch management and updates for your Azure VMs to ensure security and stability? So for this, you can start by explaining that you rely on Azure Update Management to schedule and automate patching for both Windows and Linux VMs. This ensures patches are applied consistently across your environment. Step 2 is group machines strategically. So mention that you would group VMs based on environment like dev, test, production, and critically, so maintenance windows can be tailored to minimize disruption. After that, explain that you configure pre- and post-deployment scripts to verify that patches were applied successfully and handle any required reboots. You also set up alerts to quickly identify any patching failures so you can act immediately. Now, the next step is centralized and automated approach. So emphasize that this centralized and automated method keeps your VM secured and compliant while reducing manual effort and human error. So this answer shows you use Azure native tools effectively and take a proactive, organized approach to maintaining system security and stability. Now let's move on to our second last question in this job role, which is, what monitoring and alerting strategies do you implement to proactively detect and respond to Azure infrastructure issues? So your first step would be using Azure Monitor for comprehensive data collection. So you can start by explaining that you use Azure Monitor to gather metrics and logs from all critical Azure resources, giving you full visibility into system health. Step 2 is to mention that you create custom alerts based on important thresholds like CPU usage, memory pressure, or disk latency. These alerts are configured to notify the operations team promptly via email or webhook. Next, explain that you write log analytics queries to detect anomalies or patterns that might signal upcoming failures, allowing you to act before things break. Highlight that alerts can trigger automated remediation workflows through Azure Automation Runbooks, reducing response time and manual intervention. And finally, add that you routinely review dashboards and perform capacity planning to catch risks early and maintain smooth operations. So your answer shows a proactive, well-rounded monitoring strategy using Azure tools, emphasizing early detection and quick resolution to minimize downtime. So now let's move on to our last question, our 10th question, which is, what's your approach to tagging Azure resources and how does it help with management and cost control? So here you can start by saying you establish a consistent tagging policy with key tags like environment, department, project, owner, and cost center. This creates a common language for your resources. Next, mention that you enforce tagging compliance using Azure policy, ensuring every resource created follows the tagging standards. Step 3 is to explain that consistent tags let you filter and report costs precisely in Azure Cost Management, making budgeting and cost allocation by department or project accurate and transparent. And then highlight that tags also help identify who owns each resource and track its life cycle status, which streamlines management and accountability. And finally, mention that you embed tagging into automation scripts or ARM templates, so tagging happens automatically during resource deployment. So by answering in this way, it shows that you understand tagging as a foundational practice for cost control governance, and operational efficiency, a crucial skill for managing large Azure environments. So now that we have completed our question and answers for the Azure Administrator role, now let's move on to Azure Solution Architect role. So let's move on to our first question, which is, can you describe your experience designing hybrid cloud architectures and how you ensure scalability and reliability? So here's how you can answer this question. Start by saying you focus on seamless integration between on-premises environments and Azure. Mention using Azure Virtual Network, peering along with VPN gateway or express route to establish secure high bandwidth connections. Step 2, explain that for scalability, you design systems using Azure scale sets and app services that automatically adjust resources based on demand, ensuring your architecture can handle workload changes efficiently. Now, step 3 is about building reliability with availability zones. So talk about leveraging availability zones to distribute workloads across physically separate locations within the same region. This minimizes risks from hardware or facility failures. Finally, highlight how Azure Site Recovery helps by replicating workloads to secondary regions, providing near-instant disaster recovery and ensuring business continuity. This answer shows your knowledge of hybrid cloud tools and best practices for designing architectures that are both scalable and highly reliable, exactly what interviewers want to hear. Our next question is, yes, you mentioned availability zones. So can you explain how you would architect an application to leverage them effectively? So here the first step is deploy redundancy across zones. So you start by explaining that you deploy redundant instances of your application components across at least 2 availability zones within the same Azure region. This way, if one zone experiences an issue, the others continue serving users. Step 2, mention that you configure Azure Load Balancer or Application Gateway to distribute traffic evenly across these instances. These services also perform health checks to automatically route traffic away from any unhealthy instances. Next, explain that for data durability, you use zone redundant storage and databases configured with zone-aware availability, groups that replicate data synchronously, ensuring consistency. And then summarize that this architecture keeps your application highly available and consistent even if an entire zone fails. So when you answer in this way, the answer shows a solid understanding of fault isolation, traffic management, and data replication within Azure's availability zones, all key to building resilient applications. So now let's move on to our third question, which is, let's talk security. How do you implement identity and access management across hybrid environments? So when asked this question, you have to start by explaining that you implement Azure Active Directory as a central identity platform. You integrate it with on-premises Active Directory using Azure AD Connect to enable seamless single sign-on and federation. And in step 2, mention that access is controlled through role-based access control, granting users only the permissions necessary for their roles. This follows the principle of least privilege. After that, explain that you use privileged identity management to reduce risks by enabling just-in-time elevated access with approval workflows and time limits. So high-level permissions aren't always active. And finally, highlight that you implement conditional access policies which apply adaptive authentication controls based on factors like user location, device compliance, or risk levels, improving overall security. So this answer shows you understand how to create a secure, flexible identity and access management system that works across both cloud and on-premises environments, a critical skill for hybrid setups. Now our fourth question is, how do you automate infrastructure deployments at scale? What tools do you prefer? So begin by saying you rely heavily on infrastructure as code to automate deployments. Mention using tools like Terraform and Azure Resource Manager templates. Highlight that Terraform's modularity and multi-cloud support make it ideal for complex or hybrid environments, while ARM templates provide deep integration with Azure services. So explain that you integrate these templates into Azure DevOps pipelines to automate provisioning, testing, and deployment. This ensures deployments are consistent, repeatable, and error-free. After that, mention using Azure Automation Runbooks for post-deployment configurations and operational tasks, which reduces manual effort and increases reliability. So your answer demonstrates strong knowledge of IAC principles and practical uses of popular tools and automation pipelines, which are crucial for scalable infrastructure management. So now let's move on to our fifth question, which is, suppose you have a tight budget, how do you optimize cloud costs without compromising performance? So the first step would be analyzing costs thoroughly. So explain that you use Azure Cost Management to analyze your environment and identify idle or underutilized resources that are wasting money. Step 2 is applying right sizing. So mention that you right size VMs by scaling down any oversized instances based on actual CPU and memory usage, helping eliminate unnecessary expenses. Then highlight that for predictable workloads, you invest in reserved instances or savings plans to get significant discounts on compute costs. Next, explain that you implement a strict tagging strategy to track costs accurately by department or project, ensuring teams are accountable for their usage. And finally, say you set up auto-scaling policies that adjust resource allocation dynamically based on demand, so you only pay for what you actually need. So this answer shows you balance cost efficiently with maintaining performance using Azure native tools and best practices to optimize spending smartly. Also, before moving on to the next question, if you want this guide in the downloadable format, you can scan this QR code which was given in the video, or also you can find it in the description below. So now let's move on to the sixth question, which is, you touched on disaster recovery earlier. Can you detail how you would design and validate a DR plan? So here's a clear way to answer it. Step 1 is define recovery objectives. So start by explaining that you work with stakeholders to define recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives based on business needs. These set the goals for how quickly systems must be restored and how much data loss is acceptable. After that, mention that you replicate critical workloads to a secondary Azure region using Azure site recovery. This enables rapid failover in case of a primary site failure. Next step, explain that you configure Azure backup with appropriate policies and retention to ensure data protection. Highlight that you regularly conduct failover drills, simulating outages to verify that recovery procedures and timings meet service level agreements. Talk about reviewing drill results to identify gaps or failures and updating the plan accordingly to improve readiness. And finally, stress the importance of keeping documentation up to date and setting up automated alerts to ensure the team is always prepared for real incidents. So this answer shows a thorough, practical approach to DR planning and validation, which is critical for business continuity. So now let's move on to our seventh question, which is, an application you architected is experiencing intermittent network latency. How would you troubleshoot this? So here's how you can answer it. Start by explaining that you would use Azure Network Watcher to monitor traffic flow and spot any bottlenecks or dropped packets causing delays. After that, mention that you would check NSD rules carefully to find any unintended blocks or throttling affecting traffic intermittently. After that, you can explain that you would review route tables to ensure routing paths are correct and investigate any forced tunneling or custom routes that might be causing latency. Now, if your application uses hybrid connectivity, you'd verify VPN or express route connections and their latency metrics. And then use traffic analytics to identify any unusual traffic spikes or misconfigurations impacting performance. And finally, you would optimize routing configurations or adjust NSG rules to resolve the latency issue. So here your answer shows a methodical troubleshooting approach using Azure tools, demonstrating your ability to diagnose and fix complex network issues. Moving on to our eighth question, which is, how do you approach migrating complex on-premises workloads to Azure? So first step is assess with Azure Migrate. Explain that you would use Azure Migrate to perform a thorough assessment of workloads, including dependencies and readiness for migration. After that, tell that based on business goals and technical needs, you would select appropriate strategies like rehosting for quick migration or refactoring for modernization. After that, explain that you approach migration in phases, starting with pilot workloads to validate the process and minimize risks before the full cutover. And finally, highlight that post-migration, you optimize the cloud architecture to ensure it's scalable and cost-efficient. So by answering in this way, it shows that you understand a structured, risk-managed migration approach using Azure tools, exactly what interviewers want. Now let's move on to our second last question in this job role, which is, when multiple teams are involved, how do you ensure architecture consistency and governance? So here you can start by saying that you implement Azure policy to automatically enforce compliance and guardrails across subscriptions, ensuring everyone follows the rules. And then mention that Azure blueprints let you package policies, role assignments, and ARM templates into reusable environment templates. This makes it easy to spin up standardized, compliant environments. Now next comes standardized infrastructure as code. So explain that you encourage sharing and reuse of IAC modules among teams to maintain consistency in resource deployments. Also highlight that regular architecture review meetings and cross-team workshops help align everyone, promote knowledge sharing, and prevent technical debt or divergence. So this answer shows how to combine automation and collaboration to maintain strong governance and consistency across large multi-team Azure projects. Now moving on to our last question, can you give an example where you had to redesign an existing architecture to improve scalability or security? So here's how you can frame this answer. Start by describing the legacy system. For example, a monolithic application that needed improvement. Then talk about how you transitioned to a microservices architecture using Azure Kubernetes Service and Azure Functions. So this approach lets you scale components independently and isolate faults better. Next, mention migrating to managed identities and using Azure Key Vault for secure secrets management, removing hard-coded credentials and strengthening security. Finish by explaining how these changes boosted deployment agility, improved security, and increased overall system resilience. So your answer demonstrates your ability to modernize applications thoughtfully, balancing scalability and security. Qualities interviewers highly value from a candidate applying for this role.
So I hope these questions help you feel more confident for your next Azure interview. If you want us to cover the question and answers for other Azure Cloud job roles, let us know in the comment section below. And if you're serious about landing a high-paying job in the field of Azure Cloud, definitely check out our free masterclass where we have helped thousands of individuals gain confidence and land their dream jobs. You can register through the link in the description below. Also make sure that you watch this video next to know more about how to get certified in Microsoft Azure. Thanks for watching.